Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. All right, hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. I am very delighted and excited and energized to have Anthony Myint on the show.
Hey, Ethan, thanks for having me.
Honestly, it's an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation. And of course, we always love to get the show started with a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing at the moment.
So I'm a chef, essentially kind of turned climate crusader at this point. Um, I began my career in restaurants in San Francisco in a really improbable way. We started doing pop-ups before that even was a term. Journalists kind of coined the phrase around what we were doing. We did pop-ups, once or twice a week for like 2 years. Uh, really helped kind of establish that movement. It turned into a permanent pop-up called Mission Chinese Food. That became successful. We opened another location in New York, ostensibly in a shitty Thai takeout window. And miraculously, that one won New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012. And so we kind of were like off to the races.
Cool.
I can get into a lot more detail on that if you want,
Definitely.
but basically at some point along the line, my wife and I had a daughter, and we just started to think a lot about climate change and the future. And so we wanted to kind of shift our focus from um, basically just running restaurants to kind of making the industry part of the solution.
Love it, man. Thanks for doing that. I really appreciate it. And did you go to like culinary school or anything?
I didn't. I'm self-taught in the kitchen, so a lot of our uh, driving force in a way is almost just like this can-do spirit and this feeling of like, why doesn't somebody just do X, Y, Z? And then, as it turns out, that is often because doing X, Y, Z is really hard.
For real, man. Yeah, no, self-taught's the way to go. It's the painful route, but I think it's the most fulfilling in my humble opinion. So yeah, let's unpack Mission Chinese Food a little bit more. So tell me about your experience kind of getting started, because I had read somewhere online that like you had like this resounding success in San Francisco, that people were actually getting mad that there were so many people in the street, and you like started going door to door asking people like what exactly?
Well, I mean, it begins even before the pop-up. We started doing a gourmet, essentially kind of like food truck, like taco truck. And it was around the time that Twitter was starting and different things were starting. So it just kind of felt like a whole new world of possibilities. We did that literally just for like 4 weeks. And like each week it was like busier and crazier. And then the fourth week, there were like tons of people online. And um, this neighbor who was like a real estate mogul, like the CEO of a real estate company, kind of drove by in his BMW convertible, like yelling at everybody, and kind of called the police on people who were like, drinking a beer in a brown bag, standing in line and stuff like that. And we just kind of decided like, shoot, I don't want to like have this fight every week. And so then we just kind of went door to door in the mission looking for places that, had like not that much business and where we could kind of work with the business to do a pop-up there.
Cool. So it's called Mission because like the neighborhood was Mission, not because there was like a mission behind the business, right?
Yeah, that's right. But actually, I mean, the whole time we were doing these pop-ups, we just it was a hobby, and we felt like, you know, definitely we were not expecting that to turn into a career. And so each week, the pop-up had a beneficiary where like we kept a couple $100 to like cover our time, and then all the remaining proceeds went to local food banks and local food pantries and things. So even the original Mission Chinese Food, has always kind of had a charitable component. I think we've raised over like 1.5 million meals for the local food bank since we started. But again, at some point, we started to feel like, okay, climate change is like, a really important, nobody's really working on this in the restaurant industry. So let's give it a shot.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk all about zero footprint and what you're doing with that. But were you working like a full-time job while you're doing this pop-up as well? Because you said it was only a couple days a week.
Yeah, I was a line cook at a really good restaurant called Bar
Uh,
Tartine, and kind of working full time there, and then prepping for Mission Street Food before and after. And um, my wife was a PhD student at Berkeley, so she was like, teaching classes, taking classes, etc., and would be like running back to like kind of be the cashier at the food truck and different things.
Oh, that's so badass, man. Are you from San Fran originally?
I grew up in the DC suburbs, like in Northern Virginia, and moved to San
Okay.
Francisco in 2004.
Really cool, man. All right, let's talk about how Mission, which is it's just called Mission now, right? The restaurant. There's two.
The New York one is just called Mission and has kind of like branched away from like weird Chinese to just whatever the chef,
Okay.
super awesome chef Danny, whatever he feels like. The one in San Francisco is still Mission Chinese food, and it's more like in a Chinese hole in the wall, serving like weird versions of traditional Chinese food.
Yeah, cool. So how did your experience with this kind of transfer and inspire you to start this zero food print project, which is, seems to be your main passion now?
Well, in a lot of ways, what happened is the improbable success of Mission Chinese food just like um, we almost like ascended to the like celebrity chef world, through the back door. And so we would be like at the chef conferences, like drinking beers with the number one chef in the world and kicking a soccer
Wow.
ball around and this kind of stuff. And then, after we had a daughter, we just started to realize like, well, first of all, we have a platform, we could start doing something, but also we have access to all this cultural capital, and like really even like the fiscal capital of the industry is massive. So for reference, like the restaurant industry pre-COVID was 860 billion dollars, bigger than all of food retail, bigger than all of agriculture. In the US, it was between restaurants and food service, like at cafeterias and stuff, 1 out of 10 workers. So just like absolutely huge industry, but also, everybody's kind of like running around, doesn't have time to use the bathroom or like eat lunch or whatever. You're worried about like putting out fires. Is my dishwasher drunk? My meat order didn't show up, whatever thing. And so nobody really is engaged with like climate and like 2 generations down the line, what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I'd say it's a blessing that this great responsibility and honor is placed on you. Go, you said getting into the upper echelons of the restaurant industry through the back door. I'm glad that someone like you has a bit of the spotlight. Can you tell me exactly what zero food print is?
Yeah, so we began by trying to basically help chefs and restaurants become part of the solution. And so we would work with the restaurant to conduct a life cycle assessment. They would make some best practice changes, maybe tweak the menu, um, change some equipment use and different things. But basically what we found is there was always a footprint left, like,
What what is a life cycle assessment?
oh, it's basically like you're analyzing the carbon footprint of all the different factors of the operation, so the energy use, the waste hauling, the laundry, the ingredients. Um, and so you would do that kind of assessment. And what we found is basically in almost every case, ingredients were the vast majority of the restaurant's carbon footprint. Like at Mission Chinese, it was like 70 or 75% of the carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you think about it, like if you're a Chinese restaurant, if you're a burger shop, like you're not all of a sudden going to switch to become like a raw, vegan restaurant. Like you're kind of
Totally.
doing business as it is. And so there's limitations to uh, all of that research in terms of like the the cherry tomato from a good farm versus a conventional farm or whatever. And frankly, there's just not that much data about the difference from one operation to another in terms of like farming.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so what we started to learn is just that there's a much, much bigger impact from changing how food is grown than just choosing different ingredients within the current system.
Yeah, no, beyond a doubt, how we grow things is so essential, and it goes into land use as well, which is super important. But so are you running a corporation or is it a nonprofit organization? What exactly is your group?
I'm sorry. So Zero Footprint's a nonprofit. And so we began doing this kind of work oriented around a restaurant or an operation's carbon footprint. And then in 2019, we began collaborations with state agencies in California, like the Department of Food and Agriculture, uh, to, to basically begin a different approach, which is more centered around the opportunity for improving or the opportunity to support climate solutions. So rather than kind of focus on what you're doing, it's more like focusing on what you could do. And that kind of changes the whole script from like, delaying the inevitable, anxiety, like crawl into bed, it's inevitable, to just like, oh, we can totally solve it. And part of some of our approach, and a lot of like this almost like societal shift on climate, has been informed by this organization, Project Drawdown.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so you may know all about it, but you know, essentially hundreds of climate experts came together to kind of analyze their solutions in their respective sectors. So some people were analyzing renewable energy, some were analyzing food waste reduction, some were analyzing regenerative ag, some were analyzing educating girls. And so for each strategy, they kind of estimated the plausible adoption rate and the cost benefit. Like how much would it cost to implement it at that scale? How many tons of, billions of tons of carbon would come out of the atmosphere at that level? And then how much would it save society? And so what's amazing is that, this research is showing that if we just do all the solutions at their plausible rates of adoption, we could lower global temperatures. We could take 1 trillion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, literally just solve the whole climate crisis. It would cost about $29 trillion globally. And that, could roll out over time between now and 2050. So $29 trillion is a lot of money,
Yeah.
but it's also just 1% of GDP each year.
That's,
And so it really frames it, from like impossible to more like totally doable. And if it was going to cost 100% of GDP each year, like, okay, I would admit it, we're fucked. But if it's like just 1%, then it becomes like super easy to do.
yeah, no, I love the way you look at it like that. And then your plan is to have restaurants could offset their carbon footprints with a 1% like fee, right? That's kind of one of the ideas zero footprint represents.
Yeah, and so we don't use the word offset because that has like a really technical meaning, but
Mm-hmm.
just you would basically be changing food production, improving farming, and doing it as much or more good than the impact of your meal otherwise. So it's basically giving, citizens, consumers, diners, really anybody just a way to immediately become part of the solution.
Yeah, and that's what we need. We need everyone to get involved. Yeah, I love that. When you say 1%, it's like no big deal. I also love what you said about turning distress to opportunity. I think that's so essential right now because it can be really daunting to think about everything that's going on. But then you also think about it as if there's all these problems, we got, we are entrepreneurs. We come up with solutions. But yeah, so I want to let's talk a bit about regenerative farming. So how does regenerative farming compare to like the prevailing idea is like, oh, we need to plant all these trees to save the planet, but really, one of the biggest impacts is in agriculture. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, the first thing is that regenerative farming, the way is just kind of like good farming. A lot of indigenous groups, a lot of just sustainable, good stewards of the land have been doing these practices for years. So what's new is the science around both kind of like the global potential and also kind of like each individual farm's potential. And so at the global level, like there's some incredible stats, like this esteemed soil scientist from Ohio State is on record saying like, if we could just increase the soil carbon globally by, a couple percent, that would offset all emissions in the world. And I mean, we know that farming conventionally is systematically and gradually reducing the amount of carbon in the soil. You're plowing it, you're pouring chemicals, you're killing the life in the soil, it's starting to oxidize, go in the atmosphere. We know this, and it's been like, hundreds of billions of tons of carbon from doing that over a few decades. And I think what's exciting about regenerative ag is you can basically like undo all that damage from many decades in just like 1 decade. So in terms of planting trees, it's almost like the analog to planting trees,
Mm.
except for instead of the end result being like, a few big tree trunks that are like all this biomass, it's soil biology. It's microbes in the soil, it's fungus, it's nematodes and worms and all the good things, but it's also durable soil carbon that is the result of, that organic matter and the microbiology, doing the equivalent of like pooping or dying or whatever. And so as that biological cycle is happening, it's possible to build soil much more quickly than scientists thought. So scientists used to think that you could build soil like topsoil and sort of like that soil carbon from rock dust, essentially, sort of like mineral weathering over millennia. And now they're starting to understand through new biogeochemistry, like oh, you could just like build it in a few years as that biological cycle is taking place. And it's not just part of the carbon cycle of like a plant dying and growing each year. It's actually the biology in the soil, creating more carbon in the soil and then dying and growing and creating more and more. And so it's a whole new understanding that almost has just begun in like the last 5 or 10 years. But it's happening so quickly that like, you have all the people in the regenerative movement are super excited about it, but now you've got like, you know, regenerative ag centered in like the Biden climate plan and stuff in the last year. And so, my hope is that society will start to view regenerative ag and renewable energy like as, the two like top tier solutions. And, renewable energy, it took years and decades, but at this point, I think we all pretty much agree that it's like inevitable, right? It's going to happen. And it's just like how quickly that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And with regenerative ag, it's like the conversation's just starting, but hopefully we'll reach that same point in like 5 years or something that everyone's just like, okay, amazing. How quickly can we change acres? How can we send money towards changing acres as quickly as possible?
Yeah, or with help from you, hopefully a bit sooner than 5 years. But I'm a bit of a naive optimist when it comes to that kind of stuff. But yeah, I love the way you put it. When it comes to we call it renewable energy or energy efficiency, which is you doing less emissions, and then in addition, we also have all the what is it? The legacy emissions that are still out there already, and this is the solution that's going to pull both of them out. I've talked about carbon sequestration in the show a couple times, but yeah, man, Phil must love you. How does this look on like a practical basis? Like how can we what do farmers actually do to increase their carbon content like on a day-to-day thing?
Yeah, so it totally depends on the kind of farm and the region. And in part, that's why regenerative agriculture is a little bit of a mysterious term.
Mm-hmm.
Like with organic, it's pretty clear what organic certification is. You're not using these banned chemicals or whatever. With regenerative, it could be planting cover crops, it could be reducing tillage. A really big one is applying compost instead of fertilizer. If you're a ranch, you could be like planting trees and hedgerows and again applying compost. So like one example that really, you know, almost like inspired us to go all in on this movement was the work from this organization, the Marine Carbon Project. And so, a lot of the time where society has been like framing beef as, public enemy number one in the food system environmentally. And there's this really big opportunity to shift that script because
Mm.
basically the way we produce beef is a big source of emissions through feedlots. But the way the beef production system works is, cattle are out on land for a full year before they go in the feedlot. And so there's almost like two whole separate systems. There's that feedlot that we don't really like with, the antibiotics and the manure lagoons and all the stuff. And then
Gross.
there's 760 million acres of rangeland with cattle on it. And then that's just like one big opportunity to sequester carbon. And so we learned about this project, the Marine Carbon Project, and they were working with really sustainable producers like Albert Strauss from Strauss Family Creamery. There's a great ranch, Stemple Creek Ranch. We were serving beef from Stemple Creek Ranch at a restaurant we were running called The Perennial. And I can tell you all about that too. But basically, the numbers behind this research going on were like so mind blowing and optimistic that it really made us want to, devote our work and our careers to this. And
Cool.
so they were um, they were doing regenerative grazing on the whole ranch, and 3,500 acre ranch or something like that. So on the whole ranch, they were already taking carbon out of the atmosphere through this grazing. The numbers were about half a ton per acre per year. On 1/10 of the ranch, somebody provided funding for, the researchers provided funding for them to apply compost to jumpstart that sequestration.
Mm-hmm.
And so on that portion of the ranch, the carbon sequestration was something like 10 times as high.
Wow.
So it's like an already good thing becoming like 10x as effective through compost and, kind of uh, scaling up that soil carbon restoration through soil biology. And so the total benefit after 5 years or something, the numbers were showing that 1/10 of the ranch had taken in as much carbon as not burning 1 million gallons of gas.
Yeah, I remember you said that in one of your talks. That was awesome. Yeah, that's these figures is really how you get these ideas into people's heads to like kind of strike a chord and be like, wow, we should really make moves on something if it's like measurably beneficial, especially when we're like in the fourth quarter and we're down by a couple touchdowns. So we got to
Right.
get moving, right? One of the other things I wanted to ask you about that you've said in a couple of your talks is about how the organic movement has failed to kind of move beyond 2% of the acres of farmland. I think it was in this country. I'm curious why you think that is, and how can we kind of learn from the failures of other movements to kind of have greater success in this regenerative movement. This is like very, very important, like life or death kind of thing, you know?
Well, I don't want to frame it as a failure because I think the organic movement is amazing and super successful. Like
My
in the
bad.
past, well, no, in the past year, it's like grown like 13% or, super fast growth. But the reality is just that like capitalism is extractive.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like completely, based on how quickly you can extract natural and human resources, you know. And so basically when you imagine somebody paying like a 3x premium or 2x premium for the good organic product, if you imagine you're doing that at, a great local grocery store or at Costco or Walmart or whatever, that premium, or at a restaurant, that premium is trickling down through the food economy, and that farmer or rancher or whatever it is would end up with, a few cents on the dollar that the consumer's spending, and they're getting that few cents on the dollar, and that might help, them kind of make ends meet and like have a good livelihood, but it's definitely not kind of enough uh, momentum essentially to
Mm-hmm.
like incentivize a neighboring farmer to like borrow $500,000 from a bank, switch to regenerative organic, plant 10,000 trees, apply tons of compost, plant a bunch of cover crops, begin a whole new like direct to consumer program or whatever. Like there's no way for anybody to switch. And so in a way, going back to this renewable energy analogy, it's almost like saying, hey, why doesn't every single citizen just like borrow $20,000, climb up on the roof, put up solar panels, negotiate with their landlord, all the different things. No one expects anybody to do that. That's not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
But there's programs like across the country that just started in around 2015 where consumers are improving the grid. And so, you're paying $5 a month on your utilities bill. Maybe it's beginning as an opt-in program. 10% of people opt in, then 20, then 30. Then the city council flips it. It becomes an opt-out program. 90% of people are participating. Millions of dollars is flowing to improve the grid. Hundreds of cities and counties have switched to, have made commitments to 100% renewable energy through those kinds of like collective action frameworks. And so the proposal in the food system with regenerative ag is like, well, we basically need to switch all the acres, half the acres, like a really, really big undertaking. So let's see, is that going to happen from like a few people, buying the good cherry tomatoes at the farmer's market? It's like billions of dollars of change has to happen. Or should we just start getting like $1 a month from everybody and just start switching it? And it could even be $1 a month on the trash bill to build compost infrastructure and pay to get that compost onto farms and ranches. While you're at it, why don't you have cool businesses opting in and sending 1%, et cetera. And so that's sort of where I think we're in the very, very early days of it, but we're seeing our work as kind of creating that seamless circular economy where, 1 penny per dollar can just go towards this solution instead of like making it impossible for people, like, hey, go drive across town and buy the $5 cherry tomatoes, and then let's cross our fingers and hope that 50 years from now something changes. We're saying like, send the 1 penny, let's just change it next month.
What a response, man. That was awesome. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Amazing response. Wow. I need to go back and think about that a lot more. But for the sake of the podcast, I'm curious why you've decided to expand here to Colorado, because your food print began in California, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it really began because while we were running this restaurant, The Perennial, we met Phil Taylor from Mad Ag,
My boy.
and Mad Agriculture. And, so like, here's a guy who's a former biogeochemist, understands carbon farming, and has shifted to community organizing, right? Like grassroots organizing, literally grassroots and also figuratively. And so like I was very impressed with his approach and mindset and things. But also, Colorado is really one of the world leaders in carbon farming.
Right.
And so, like, Colorado State University has created this model called the Comet Planner that is basically making it possible to estimate how beneficial a carbon farming practice is. So you mentioned tree planting before.
Mhm.
So decades ago, whatever it might be, scientists would go out and probably put like a tape measure around each tree, do some calculations, how tall it is, how the diameter. Okay, so here's how much carbon is coming out of the atmosphere from a forestry project. Takes a lot of work, a lot of tape measures around trees. At some point, they just simplified that whole process and it's an estimate. Maybe a satellite is, doing some imaging and you're doing a calculation. Maybe it's not as accurate. Maybe there's a 10%, fluctuation, but it's obviously way more practical to like estimate the benefit that way. So with carbon farming, that ability didn't exist before. I mean, how would it exist? You would have to like go take a soil sample, run that through a lab. Each acre is different. So you're taking like 1,000 soil samples for one farm, all these things. It's cost prohibitive, so no one did anything ever in terms of soil carbon. And then in the past few years, people have started to understand like, oh, we got to start doing this. And so they've developed this modeling tool. It's early. They're going to keep improving the model. The confidence interval is going to keep getting better. But this allows everybody to start moving forward directionally. So Colorado is really one of the leaders of carbon farming, and there's a really good regenerative movement in Boulder and Colorado overall.
Yeah, and let's keep it going, man. Tell me about your partnership with. Are you working with the city of Denver, city of Boulder, county of Boulder? How is the government involved with this?
So it began with a connection between Phil and Office of Sustainability at City of Boulder, and then they looped in County of Boulder, which was able to apply for a USDA grant. Really modest grant. I think it's about $45,000 a year for 2 years to
Beautiful.
just start building, a compost infrastructure and momentum around compost application and stuff. So they're using some of the funds from that grant to just cover a little bit of our staff time and Matt Agriculture staff time to just work on this and build up this movement. So that's how Restore Colorado began. And our hope is to kind of build this up into a statewide movement, really soon. And it's been amazing, just like, being on calls each week or every 2 weeks or whatever with, folks from Boulder County, and then Denver's Office of Climate Action and Sustainability and Resilience joined the, group. And it really has been eye-opening for me to kind of like look behind the veil at how government works. Because basically, there's almost like this impression from the public of like government is moves slowly. It's like a bunch of, pencil pushers or, whatever, it's inefficient or something.
Mm,
Government is, maybe that's part of it, some people or whatever, but another part of government is like just a bunch of like awesome people working as hard as they can to like, do good and solve problems. The issue is just not enough money.
right.
Like if you gave every government in the world like an extra million, an extra $1 billion, think how many more problems they would solve. So the issue here with carbon farming is that, state of California, Boulder County, et cetera, everybody wants to do more carbon farming. They don't have a budget for it.
Mm,
So, you could imagine like, okay, it's too important. We got to start doing it. So what would you do? Like defund education, defund renewable energy, defund mass transit? No, those are all good things too. And so this type of program is exciting, and that's why sort of like some governments are starting to work with us, because it's a way for the consumer who wants this thing anyway. You want more resilience in your community and your food system. You want more water because you're staring down the barrel of a drought year, or everything.
yep.
You want healthier food. And if consumers are willing to pay that one penny, then we can start changing, thousands of acres, millions of acres. If not, then it's going to be 10, 20 years until it's too important and governments start having more budget for it. And even then, it would only come from taxes anyway.
Yeah. Well, you can have all the pennies you want from me, Anthony. That's no problem at all.
Awesome.
Let's let's talk a little bit about more about Restore Colorado, because I have not heard of it until we were connected. So how is it distinct from Zero Footprint, and what is like the mission and the vision behind Restore Colorado?
Well, thanks for, and it'll be a good chance to clarify. So Zero Footprint is our nonprofit organization. And we're essentially like working with businesses and, philanthropists, citizens to just get money towards these solutions. And
Absolutely.
then the Restore Colorado, fund essentially is like where that money goes. And then we're working with Mad Agriculture and other, soon to be other local conservation experts on providing grants to farms and ranchers to fund these changes on acres. And so it's literally just like, to pay for the compost, to pay for the cover crop seeds, a little bit of labor to, plant the seeds and do these things. Um, and so basically Restore is like the grant program
Hmm.
run by Zero Foodprint in collaboration with local stakeholders.
Yeah. Okay. I gotcha. That makes sense. All right. So let's talk a little bit about something local. I'm not sure how many times you've been over to the, is it McCauley Family Farm in Longmont? So this is like the pilot project that you guys are working on over here. So how is that looking on like a day-to-day basis? Because this is something that people in this city in Boulder can actually go and visit.
Yeah, so Marcus McCauley's an amazing grower, doing work on his family farm. And also, I think there's some early collaborations with Boulder County to do regenerative carbon farming practices on some land that was heavily degraded from other uses, but is kind of like owned by the county and is part of like the ag and open space districts. And so, Marcus is doing great work. I haven't been to his farm. It's mostly, Mad Agriculture is kind of like the boots on the ground and our farming experts in the region.
Love them.
Um, but basically, they've also organized a few other projects with frontline farming in Denver and uh, gamma grass on livestock. And so just a couple different projects are already starting to be underway kind of concurrently with Macaulay's.
Right. Hmm. It's very interesting stuff. So complicated. It's like trying to understand how nature works and how we're like the stewards of the planet. It's so if only there was a way to kind of get everyone, yeah, like diagrams or some sort of models to show people that makes it very simple. I like how you use numbers and figures like 1% or 2% to get people to be like, oh, all I have to do is give a penny and I'll be good. But let's talk about this idea of like table to farm versus like farm to table, because that's this, if we we make a bill and we get a surcharge of 1%, that's like table to farm, whereas the what I talked to Phil about was like farm to table. So what is like the distinction between those two ideas, and why are you a proponent of one over the other?
Well, I'm definitely a proponent of both.
Okay.
But what we've known for years in the food system is farm to table. And that's basically like supporting the good farmer. Let's buy the good stuff. Hopefully if we do that, more farmers will switch, to
The
regenerative
slow
organic
method
practices.
in theory.
Yeah. And so we should all do that. Like if you can afford to do that, if you have the bandwidth to like buy from good farmers and stuff, we should. Americans spend something like 6% of their income on food. It's the lowest of any developing nation, or whatever. A lot of that
Interesting.
is because the federal government farm bill, like the way it's organized, almost like incentivizes unhealthy soil. And
Yeah.
it's sort of like created an artificially cheap food system. So that's part of why, you have these, big problems where it's like a conventional farmer has crop insurance. If they switch to regenerative or organic practices, they're not eligible for crop insurance anymore. Why would anybody switch? You would be taking like a huge risk by switching. All these different issues that are like too big for the average consumer at the grocery store or at a restaurant. What the table to farm movement that we're starting is trying to do is make it possible to just send that one penny to make the direct change immediately. And so instead of like trying to make a good choice within almost like a fundamentally broken system, we're saying like just use one penny and just make the change that we all want to see.
Right. That's really cool. That makes a lot of sense. I just want to ask, how do you think the average citizen can support this renewable food economy by beyond just going to restaurants that are partnered with Zero Foodprint and are making this one penny donation? How can the average citizen get involved? And then beyond just buying organic, what is something that people can do on like a day-to-day basis to get this movement moving more quickly in the right direction?
Well, thanks for asking. So I think there's a few different like calls to action that would make sense for the average person. Compost, first of all.
That's
So
huge.
it's really, really huge. If you have a local program where you could opt in pay a few bucks a month, whatever it is, and start composting. Um, that's like really, really big. Um, I heard a stat from, the biogeochemist, like science guy kind of working on compost stuff recently, where scientists think that each ton of compost applied to farmland and rangeland and stuff can take 3 to 9 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere.
Wow.
So if you think about just like, you know, a whole city that is not composting and
It's
what that
insane.
opportunity is, it's almost like a biodiesel spill, just flowing into the atmosphere. And
Yeah.
so you can do your part by just composting.
Yeah.
That's huge. There's an amazing movie, Kiss the Ground. If
Love
you
it.
want to learn more about regenerative ag, watch the movie. It's very optimistic. You
Definitely.
can we on our website, just projects like Macaulay Family Farm, you can just sign up to make a donation. So you could just be like, I'll just send $10 a month to this kind of local carbon farming work. you
Hmm.
know Project Drawdown estimates that for each dollar invested in regenerative ag and managed grazing, you get $40 in benefit. And you could think of it as like building soil wealth. And so the soil holds more water, the crops are more resilient, the food is more nutritious, the farmer is more profitable, and you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so you know I think a lot of the paralysis around climate change in a way is like, what would you do anyway? Would you fund some project in Ethiopia or something? Like, you feel really disconnected from that, right? But if you're actually able to just fund a climate beneficial project, basically in your own backyard, and has all these co-benefits for your own community, what are you waiting for? If you want to work on climate, here's how to work on it. So
Yeah.
those are, support a zero footprint restaurant, get some businesses and whatever on board. But especially you could just directly fund it or compost. Those are probably the two biggest.
Yeah. Why is it that composting is so uncommon? Is it like a newer phenomenon?
Well, the benefits are more newly understood by
Okay.
science, but the reality in a way is that like the food system, farming system, sort of like evolved out of slavery.
Classic.
And the waste hauling system, especially in like big cities and stuff, probably sort of evolved out of like the mafia, or whatever.
Right.
Um, and so it's the waste hauling system usually historically has not been about the environment. It's just been like somebody dealing with it. And you have all these great organizations like Recycle Colorado and different things, the US Composting Council and stuff working on it. Um, but I think that now that there is this understanding of the importance of compost, that infrastructure needs to happen and that shift needs to happen. That has to be like as high of a priority as renewable energy.
Definitely. Oh, geez, man. There's so many things that need to happen. And honestly, Anthony, I really appreciate the work you're doing. I appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing your story. As you might have been able to tell, a lot of this scientific soil stuff goes over my head, but I'm really glad that you came on and shared. It's really interesting how you had this prolific rise in the restaurant industry, and you've kind of chosen to go into something a lot more, I don't know, more noble, like a nonprofit to fight climate change through regenerative ag. It's really cool, man. And it's been great talking to you. I guess my last question is kind of, what advice do you have for young people who are passionate about changing our economy for the better?
Geez.
It's
Well, first of
loaded.
all, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the kind words. First, I just want to address the soil science stuff. Like, soil science is really complicated, and soil biology is really complicated, and that's part of why it's taken so long for
Hmm.
people to even like start to understand it. But I think there's also just an element of common sense, where it's like healthy soil has a lot of living things in it. Those living things make our food better and all these things. But those living things are also carbon that could either be in the atmosphere or it could be in the soil. So that's it. Like, the carbon could either be in the atmosphere or in the soil. In the atmosphere, it's bad. In the soil, it's good.
Right.
So you
That's what I
just
was gonna say.
want that to happen as quickly as possible.
Hmm. Yeah.
In terms of what advice I would give, young people or whatever, you're like, to me, the thing is just anybody in any sector can just become part of the solution. And so it's like whatever you're interested in, whoever your network is, whatever you already do, you can find a way to just make that part of the solution.
Yeah. Whether it's like reorienting your business practice to be more aware of these issues, or just giving, 1% of your income to causes that you believe in. That's the way I see it. So cool, man. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. I really appreciate you coming on, and I'd be happy to have you and Phil come on and have like a nice open forum chat one time. It'd be great. But for today, it's been a pleasure talking to you, man. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. And thanks for your great work on climate as well.
It's an absolute honor. And all right, everybody, we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Changing the Climate, the official podcast of Climate Change Realty. If you are very passionate about these issues and you know anyone considering buying or selling a home anywhere in the USA, then please visit ccrboulder.com today.